welcome here. I'm happy on many accounts. This is a great day because we're celebrating a Tunisian constitution. You may look at events and say, well, Tunisia is a piker. After all, Egypt has had 2.5 constitutions in the same amount of time. But maybe that's a sign that Tunisia is taking it more seriously. I'm happy, too, for the American Tunisian Association to see so many people. We're picking up under Bill Lawrence and pushing ahead to a greater activity. And I would just make the commercial that if you are interested in joining us, if your attraction to Tunisia is long-lasting more than this session, you can either pick up a card from Bill or do sign up. You've already signed up, but indicate to the people who are sitting out on the desk. And don't worry, we'll be back in touch with you. We have two experts on the subject to talk to us today, and I'm very happy that they're with us. The speaker, the main speaker is Duncan Pickard, who is with the Hariri Center at the Atlantic Council and also does stuff for Carnegie and their project on democracy. He's been following in great detail the process of forming a Tunisian constitution, which is a drama in itself and one that tells us a good deal about Tunisia and about the Arab Spring. And he's told us much in his writings about us, and we'll give a rundown of the Constitution today. And then commenting on him is Nathan Brown, the professor at George Washington University, also associated with Carnegie, and who is very well known for his comments on democracy and events in the Middle East. So we will go immediately to our main speaker, Duncan, and we look forward to hearing you.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Zartman, and thank you to the organizations for sponsoring this today. It's a really great pleasure to be here, and also an important opportunity to celebrate what is an extremely important process and important document that's been produced, probably the most hopeful document of the Arab Spring. For decades, it's been an axiom of Arab politics that there's an inverse correlation between the number of votes received for a particular candidate or document and that candidate or document's credibility. For a few years ago, there was a Syrian company that started producing ballot boxes, and the joke in the elections community was that these ballot boxes produced by the Syrian company would be cheaper because they would come pre-stuffed. More seriously, Egyptian's second and a half constitution recently passed in a referendum with 98% of the vote, amid widespread accusations of improprieties and exclusion. By contrast, on the other hand, 2 weeks ago, Tunisia's parliament passed its new constitution with a Ben Ali-type majority of 92%. But this time, the majority was a byproduct of consensus, not of rigging. And at least in this moment, democracy in Tunisia, democracy has replaced dictatorship as the watchword of politics. I was in Tunis the day after the constitution was finished, and the vibe was palpably hopeful, both among the members of the assembly, Radwan was there as well, who were dressed in traditional garb, wearing red roses to celebrate the event, and then handing out freshly printed copies of the Constitution to each of their colleagues to get their signatures. Outside the assembly, I was also struck by radio DJs who were reading aloud articles from the Rights and Freedoms chapter between songs, and then touting this new constitution as the birth of the Second Republic of Tunisia. There are lots of reasons why this kind of moment is remarkable. The first is that the Constitution marks the first tangible fruit of the 2011 revolution in Tunisia. This constitution stands as the best chance of being the first sustained constitution in the Arab world written outside the context of a dictatorship or an imperial power. The constitution was written consensually under the auspices of Ennahda, a moderate Islamic party. And but most remarkable of all is perhaps the success of this process in the face of several moments when it looked like the entire political transition was going to fall apart. Today I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the process by which the Constitution was made, because I think that this is the real story and how they were able to garner consensus and overcome some of these difficult moments in their transition. And I hope that some of this recounting isn't going to sound too pedantic, but there are really 2 points that I hope to come out of this fairly long and complicated story. The first is that there was a genuine commitment to building consensus along the way, and also that there was a commitment to establishing a legal order defined by the rule of law. And as you'll see, I think that both of these elements have been critical to the success of the process. So the constitution-making story in Tunisia really begins with the formation of a committee called the Benashor Commission. And this was a political reform commission that was established immediately after the revolution. And it was a group of about 12 legal experts from around Tunisia, from different law faculties in Tunisia, that were called together to amend the existing constitution and bring it up to standards that were demanded by the revolution. Very quickly, the commission decided that it wasn't going to amend the existing constitution. It was going to create a process for an entirely new constitution. And what they called for was the election of a constituent assembly. And they then were merged with a second commission that was made up of political parties and civil society groups to debate the way that this constituent assembly was going to be elected. The legal experts drafted an electoral law that was adopted by these political parties and civil society groups. And one of the striking features of the Benashor Commission at this time was that they had equal representation from each of the registered political parties in Tunisia, which meant that Ennahda, which eventually came to lead the process, Ennahda was on equal ground with all of the other political parties in Tunisia. So there were about 50 representatives and 2 from each party, which meant that Ennahda was dramatically outnumbered. And this led to some real conflicts within the Benashor Commission, and at one point Ennahda even withdrew its support from the commission, and even though it continued to write the electoral law. Even though they no longer were participating in the commission, Ennahda competed in the elections for the Constituent Assembly, which happened in October of 2011, and Ennahda won that election handily. They won about 40% of the seats in the assembly, and also about 40% of the votes nationwide. And this was in a field of over 150 parties, and the next most popular party won about half of the seats. And then immediately after this election, Ennahda formed a governing coalition of 2 secular parties, which was largely seen as sort of a coalition of strange bedfellows in Tunisia, with particularly with one party called Tekatol, which was sort of a French socialist party, which was funny to join up with this moderate Islamic party. And one of the real reasons for Ennahda's success was the popularity of its president, Rashid Ghannouchi, who was one of the leading thinkers, one of the leading Islamic thinkers of the 21st century, and his writings in the 1970s and 1980s formed the cornerstone of moderate political Islam, advocating a personal recommitment to the principles of Islam as an alternative to what he saw as the imperialist politics that had condemned his region to poverty. And one of the open questions after this election was the extent to which Ghannouchi was going to try and use the party to impose these views of political Islam on the new Tunisian electoral system, which really hadn't been defined by Islamist politics for several decades under the Ben Ali era. So this is sort of where we stand. There's questions about Ennahda, how Islamist are they going to be in this process, and they're also ruling in coalition with these 2 secular parties. So constitutionally speaking, the Constituent Assembly began its work in November of 2011, and the committee or the Assembly organized itself into 6 committees, each of which was going to debate chapters related to the future constitution. And these 6 committees were organized around the preamble, the chapter on rights and freedoms, the executive and legislative powers and the relationship between the legislature and the executive, the judicial authority, independent constitutional commissions, and decentralization. And the members of the Assembly were placed on each of these 6 committees. And two really key debates on the Constitution emerged early on. The first was about the role of religion in society and in the Constitution. And it's a hallmark of Islamist parties to push for some kind of reference to Islamic Sharia as a source of legislation in constitutions. And there was a debate within Ennahda about what kind of formulation of Islamic Sharia they were going to try and put in the Constitution. And I mentioned this story to Nathan one time. There was this really fascinating moment in March of 2012 when Ennahda was debating how Islamic Sharia was going to be represented in the Constitution. 2012, sorry. March 2012, after the March 2012. Please keep doing that, though. You'll have another opportunity, I'm sure. There was a rally in Tunis that was attended by a number of Salafis, and there were some senior members of the Ennahda party that also spoke at this rally. And so one senior Ennahda official comes up on stage, and he starts shouting, "Masdar min masadar," or a source among sources of legislation, which is sort of the least antagonizing formulation, depending on your perspective. And all of the then there are a number of Salafis standing, sort of bearded guys standing behind him on the stage, and they come out and they start chanting al-Masdar al-Raisi, saying that they want the primary source of legislation. And then the entire crowd starts chanting al-Masdar al-Wahid, the only source of legislation. So this sort of rhetoric was getting escalated very easily within the ranks of the Ennahda party and some of its supporters. And then around the same time, the Shura Council, the leadership of Ennahda, takes it upon themselves to say that they're actually not going to push for any form of Sharia in the Constitution whatsoever. And this is a really, really remarkable moment where this was not a decision that was made by the Assembly as a whole. It was not a consensual decision made between secular parties and Islamist parties. It was simply a decision taken by Ennahda to take a more moderate stance on the way that they were on the formulation of Islam in the Constitution. So this, Islam has resurfaced as a very important issue in the Constitution, especially in the last couple weeks, which we can talk about more. But essentially, this question of what role Sharia would have in terms of lawmaking was killed with this Shura Council decision. The second important debate that emerged early on, which I would argue has come to define the entire constitution-making process, has been about the division of executive powers, and particularly the constraint of the executive, especially in the aftermath of a constraining dictatorship. Ennahda sought a parliamentary system with a weak president, largely based on the calculus that they would continue to fare well in parliamentary elections in the next few electoral cycles. A number of the secular parties were confident that a secular candidate, head-to-head with an Ennahda candidate, would be able to win a runoff presidential election. And so they were seeking a stronger president that could counter the power of an Ennahda majority or Ennahda plurality in parliament. And over the course of 6 or 9 months, this third committee that was looking at executive and legislative powers, released several drafts of that related to this theme, with various options for the division of executive powers, and this was a huge debate within this committee, and consensus was really looking impossible on this, and they couldn't actually reach consensus through 2012, and a full year after the Assembly was elected. So that's sort of where we stood at the end. The Assembly was still working through its draft chapters, but this big open question about the division of executive powers, but it was sort of on its way to coming up with some kind of consensus on a draft. Then the constitutional process was interrupted in the beginning of 2013 by the assassination of Shokri Belaid in February of 2013, just about a year ago today. And Shokri Belaid was a leftist critic of Ennahda. I would venture to say that it's still not entirely clear who killed Belaid. The government says that they just recently made a raid on a house that they killed the perpetrators of this crime, saying that it was the leader of a cell of Islamist extremists that were behind the plot. It may still be an open question. We'll sort of see. But the main story of the Belaid assassination, regardless of who assassinated him, was that this really turned up the heat on Ennahda, and the Ennahda government was accused of incompetence, and there was really a lot of pressure on them. And the takeaway from this was that the Ennahda Prime Minister Hamadi Jebali agreed to step down in the aftermath of this assassination and of the pressure that was put on him. In stepping down, Jebali was calling for a national unity government made up of technocrats and of non-party officials. The Ennahda party establishment refused to back Jebali's plan for a national unity government and actually forced him out, but then said that they were going to name their own party man in his place, which they did. And they named Ali Larayed as the prime minister. Larayed being the former interior minister and sort of an old hand of Ennahda. And so this sort of let things settle for a little while. The constitutional debates continued. In the spring, the assembly released a draft constitution with broad agreements on executive powers, tending toward a fairly strong prime minister with significant checks by the president, including a veto power from the president. This was the main feature of the spring draft that was released. And another open question related to the transition at this point was the membership of the Independent Elections Commission, which is supposed to administer the elections after the Constitution was finished. And in fact, the rumor was that on July 24th, Wednesday, July 24th, all of the parties in the Assembly had gotten together and agreed on the 9 members of the Elections Commission that were supposed to carry the transition forward. And they were going to vote on it the next day. The next day was Thursday, July 25th, which was the day that a second political assassination rocked Tunis. And this was of Mohammed Brahmi, this time another leftist critic of Ennahda and a member of the Constituent Assembly. And the meeting of the Assembly was cancelled on the day of July 25th, and so they couldn't actually vote on these 9 members. In addition to this being a horrible tragedy, they couldn't vote on the 9 members of the Elections Commission. The second assassination renewed these calls of incompetence of the Ennahda government, and calls for the resignation of Prime Minister Larayed in favor of a new technocratic government in the form that Jebali had been advocating for several months before. Furthermore, some 70 members of the secular members of the Assembly boycotted and held their own parallel meetings of the Assembly, forestalling any agreement on the remainder of the Constitution or the way that the process was going to continue. Another important thing happening at this time, just 2 weeks before Brahmi's assassination, was the ouster of Mohamed Morsi in Egypt, right next door, which also made Ennahda very skittish. Not because the Tunisian army is much weaker and much less politicized than the Egyptian army, but they were concerned about similar kinds of veto players in Tunisia, in particular the National Labor Union, the UGTT, which by calling for a general strike could have the same kind of veto effect potentially as the military in Egypt pulling the plug on Morsi. So I think that this is actually an overlooked feature of Tunisian politics, where the way that Morsi's ouster empowered the secular parties and also made Ennahda quite skittish. So this I think this was the low point of the transition. This is when it really looked like everything was about to fall apart. There was no agreement on the way that the transition was going to continue, and also the constitution was completely up in the air. At that point, there was a national dialogue that was called for to try and break the deadlock. And this was going to bring some of the main players in Tunisian politics to the table. The dialogue was going to be moderated by a group of four labor unions, the most important of which being the UGTT, the National Labor Union. And then the other two players were Rafik from Ennahda, and also Beji Qaida Sebsi from a new party called Nidat Tunis. Now, Sebsi is the poster child of the political establishment in Tunisia. He was a cabinet official under Habib Bourguiba during the 70s and 80s. He was also president of the Chamber of Deputies under Ben Ali. He's 87 years old. He's from Monastir, I believe, which is sort of the heart of the Bourguiba loyalists in Tunisia. And he's really just sort of the epitome of the old guard. And in 2012, I believe, he founded a political party called Nidat Tunis, which was supposed to represent was supposed to unify some of the secular parties in the opposition to Ennahda. Sebsi had also been very public about his interest in bringing back a strong presidential system. He has said many times that he thinks that the U.S. president is too weak for his taste, and that Tunisia really needs a strong president to carry them through this time. And so this was this is the crux of the debate, right, between Ennahda on the one hand, Nidat Tunis on the other, UGTT trying to moderate between them. And there were four main issues that these parties had to agree with through the course of this national dialogue. One was, again, the appointment of the members of the Elections Commission, which was so close to getting agreement, but then it really looked like it was going to everything was going to fall apart over this. So the appointment of the members of the Elections Commission, agreement on the remaining questions of the Constitution, primarily executive powers, a date for elections, whether the elections should take, the date for the elections, whether that should be set before the Constitution is finished or after, and also the resignation of the current government, the resignation of the Larayed government, and then who would take over from Larayed. Larayed actually already agreed that he would step down, but it was a question of who was going to take his place. Ennahda had already agreed to step down, but they wanted to finish the constitution before they would actually remove themselves from power, as they thought that the constitution would be a bulwark against a new government delaying elections and postponing implementation of the constitution. But secular groups did not want Ennahda in power during the elections for fear that an Ennahda government would make the elections less impartial while the elections were happening. The national dialogue really was not, no one was really very optimistic of the national dialogue after several weeks either. They kept missing their deadlines of when they were going to announce different agreements on these key issues. Names for the prime minister were pitched and then rescinded. Members of the Elections Commission were about to be announced, and then the administrative court in Tunisia rejected the process by which invalidated the names that had been put forward. So it really, after the assassinations, it really looked to me like the process was going to wither in the national dialogue. But throughout it all, there were some people, some more sort of proactive people, I think, in the Ennahda party. They weren't saying this publicly, but some were saying that they should just forget getting consensus on the Constitution, and they should go for a national referendum on the Constitution, which was one of the options by which they could approve it. There were two ways. Either the Constitution could be approved by a 2/3 majority of the Assembly, or by a national referendum. Some in Ennahda were saying that they shouldn't go for this 2/3 majority and should just go straight to a national referendum, bypass this entire political process. And the Ennahda establishment rejected this idea wholeheartedly. And this never was stated publicly, and it was also never even really seriously considered by the Shura Council, I don't believe. Which I think says something about their commitment to consensus. So finally, in mid-December, the National Dialogue announced that Mehdi Juma, who was then the Minister of Industry, would succeed Larayed as Prime Minister, and then they would also start finishing up these consensus debates on the Constitution. The boycott from these assembly members had ended. The constitutional debates were resumed. And there was even a vote that was held on the members of the Elections Commission. And within a matter of weeks, all of these different pieces fell into place, and the plenary debates on the Constitution resumed. Also remarkably, Larayed agreed to step down, which was perhaps the first example of an Arab government agreeing to step down in favor of an opposition figure. I think this is a really critical moment of this entire process. It's sort of creating this tradition of the peaceful transfer of power, which is so longed for in the Arab world. Back in the Assembly, another consensus committee was working hard to reach agreement on key issues, particularly executive powers. The consensus committee agreed to a formulation that is, I think, represents really a genuine compromise between Ennahda and a secular bloc of parties, really a genuine semi-presidential system, shared powers between the president and prime minister. I think this is actually fairly problematic for the Tunisian political system, which I'll talk about in a moment, but a really genuine consensus. Not everything though was settled in this consensus committee in the Constitution. One of the more in the Assembly, one of the more famous articles out of the Constitution is Article 45, which puts in some requirements for the state to seek gender parity in elected assemblies in Tunisia. This amendment to Article 45 was an amendment that was suggested from the floor of the Assembly, not from the Consensus Committee itself. And I have to say, I was actually in the Assembly when they voted on Article 45, and this was one of the more powerful moments of my professional life. I mean, they had debated this article back and forth about the merits of gender parity, and there was screaming matches back and forth between members of the Assembly, including it within Ennahda and without. And finally they voted on it, and then every member of the Assembly rose to their feet, and even those who were opposed started singing the national anthem and cheering. It was really quite a powerful moment. A similar mood was expressed actually on the vote last Sunday, where the Assembly voted late Sunday night, 90% in favor of the Constitution. Then it was signed the next day. So that's the story of the Tunisian Constitution. So what kind of text did they actually come up with in the end that was passed by 90%? The first thing to say about it is that it is in no way an Islamist constitution. There's no feature of this constitution that can be said to be anything Islamist about it. There is these sort of hallmarks of Islamist parties, including mentioning a source for Sharia or engaging some kind of Islamic institution in lawmaking, as was called for in the first Egyptian constitution. None of this exists, and there's also no sort of Islamic court that's responsible for mediating Islamic law against the constitution. Nothing like this. The constitution is also characterized by the separation of powers. Indeed, I think that the political system that it calls for might be a little bit too divided. The way that it's laid out is that the president of the republic has exclusive authority over national security and foreign policy, and also has a veto power over certain kinds of legislation. The prime minister has authority over all forms of domestic policy, doesn't have veto power, but this question of where national security ends and domestic policy begins, I think is very problematic. And also there's a lot of potential, especially in the way that the electoral law is written, for the president and the prime minister to come from different parties and for them to try and undercut each other, especially in this highly partisan environment that we see in Tunisia right now. And I think this is probably the biggest threat for the further consolidation of democracy in Tunisia, is this conflict between the president and the prime minister. The Constitution also creates a new constitutional court that has a role in balancing power. The issue with the Constitutional Court is that it's creating a brand new institution in a system of courts that already exists, and also in the context of a very intense debate between judges and lawyers unions in Tunisia right now, each of which have a hand in appointing members to the court. And this court is really expected to do a lot. It's expected to comment on the constitutionality of draft laws, to hear challenges to the constitutionality of laws that have already been adopted, to settle disputes between the president and the prime minister. And in many cases, the Constitution requires this court to issue decisions within a period of 2 weeks, or in some cases even less. And I think that this is this is just a tall order for a new institution that hasn't been built up yet. So we know that constitutional courts are important in mediating the balance and in creating the balance of power. But the extent to which this court will be able to do this, I think, is a serious question. The other thing to say about the Constitution is that it creates a very strong rights and freedoms chapter. The list of rights and freedoms is extremely comprehensive, based largely on international standards. And it also includes a fairly technical article that's based on on rights limitations that is drawn from the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And this is the lawful limitations of human rights. So sort of where do in the words of Louis Brandeis, my right to extend my arm ends at your nose. Sort of defining where that actually takes place in law is a really beguiling question to new democracies, especially in the Arab world. And so I think that the rights in this technical article that they established on rights limitations is pretty impressive. And then the Constitution also creates some of the most progressive language in the world on auditing debt, on climate change, on women's representation, on healthcare, on workers' rights, on a lot of things. It's really quite an impressive document, and it's been called schizophrenic in places, and most constitutions are. And certainly this question of how it's going to be implemented is going to define the next couple decades. But it's really quite an impressive document that was arrived to with significant consensus. Last thing is just to talk about what comes next, the next steps for Tunisia under this new constitution. The big question for me is whether, it has been consensual, but the question is whether this constitution can broker the kind of broad elite agreement that political scientists often say is a key factor in ensuring democratic transitions. The process so far has been characterized by consensus. Many political factions have had their say. Sort of secular left-leaning law professors and political parties had their say in the Benishore Commission at the beginning of the process. Labor unions and ASEBSI had a say over part of the process in the national dialogue. Tekatol and CPR have been represented in the Troika. Technocrats now are represented in the hands of Mehdi Juma. And of course, Ennahda has been in charge the entire way, and their commitment to consensus really has been remarkable. And I think that already we have enough evidence to say that power holders in Tunisia are committed to a remarkable demonstration of the peaceful transfer of power, alternance. And it's really been in many ways sort of like a Chinese finger trap, in that if you try and the only way out of the finger trap is to come closer together and then wiggle your way out, as opposed to coming apart too quickly and then it closes everything off. I think that this has really defined the process so far, and I hope that whoever wins these next elections, I hope that they will continue these precedents that have been set for alternance, that they will still remain committed to these principles of consensus and the rule of law. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I forgot to mention in the introduction of Nathan Brown that his latest book is When Victory is Not an Option, Islamist Movements in Arab Politics. With that, your turn.
Thank you very much. When Bill Lawrence first called me and asked me to participate in this panel, my first reaction was, of course, I know nothing about Tunisia, so I don't belong there. But I thought to myself, it's no problem at all. I'll just go back and reread my Zartman to find out about the Tunisian political system. I'll read Duncan in order to find out what's been going on lately, and then he sits me between the two of them, and puts Redwan Mahmoudi in the front row in case I make a factual mistake. His Excellency, the Tunisian ambassador, in the other side of the front row. So I want to begin by doing the natural thing, and that is to change the subject to something I do know about, and that is Egyptian politics. And here I'm sort of aided because both Bill Zartman and Duncan Pickard started with the comparison to Egypt. And what I want to do is to talk about the standard comparison to Egypt that has arisen, and kind of give you my take on it, but also where it is not helpful. Because I think in some ways there's sort of a standard story that's emerged that if you look at international analyses, they take on a little bit of the tone of perhaps a sort of a nagging grade school teacher when it comes to, Egypt. Why can't you be like the good student Tunisia that does everything right, that sits and figures these things out in an orderly manner? Why do you have to behave as you do? And I think there's some helpfulness to that, but I also think, as I say, there's some ways in which the difficult parts for Tunisian politics, and some of the ways that Duncan just suggested, are just about to begin. When you take a look at this comparison, I think my own version of the Tunisia good, Egypt bad comparison focuses much less on the actors themselves. There's one way in which people can say, Tunisians begin with sort of a little bit of different attitude towards consensus, that Ennahda was in a sense a politically more mature movement towards the Brotherhood. I actually don't think that's necessarily all that true. When I take a look at the two countries back in 2011, what I see is an Egypt that actually has some very significant assets. It has some institutions that actually serve the country probably much more strongly. It has probably a stronger constitutional tradition. It probably has a stronger, more autonomous judiciary. And the Brotherhood itself, when compared to Ennahda, the comparison is usually made to Egypt's disadvantage. And again, I'm not sure that's entirely true. In some ways, it is true that Rashid al-Ghannouchi was in sort of Islamist terms, probably more progressive. But you had elements like that in the Brotherhood. You also had a much greater degree of political experience in the Brotherhood, in running for parliament, in running election campaigns, and so on, and a much greater sense in which they've been debating exactly what their political orientation had been for a generation. I remember going to Tunisia in 2011, actually securing an interview with Rashid al-Ghannouchi. I go into Ennahda headquarters, and I see right on the headquarters of the building, it says Hizb Harakat Ennahda, the party of the movement of Ennahda, which, for anybody interested in comparative Islamist movements, raises an immediate question. Which are you? Are you a political party that is dedicated to doing normal politics, or are you some kind of transformative social movement? So my first question for Ghannouchi is, which are you, a party or a movement? And this kind of severe face just drops, and he starts laughing. He says, yeah, we've got to figure that out. We've got a committee to work on that. And from what I can gather, and Duncan can update me, that committee is still at work. The party still doesn't, or the party/movement is still trying to figure out exactly what it is. The Brotherhood had, as I said, more experience. And in another way also, the Brotherhood was, I think, in Egypt, a little bit more comfortable with the idea of exercising state power. They were, Ennahda in Tunisia, again, I don't know them nearly as well ideologically, but they had a much stronger suspicion of political authority than the Brotherhood did in Egypt. Egypt, they didn't like the particular political authorities in power, but for a party or a movement that was about to enter the political process, they had a little bit stronger conception of exactly what they wanted to do. So it wasn't necessarily these specific players, and I think Duncan is right here, an awful lot had to do with process. And some of the process was, I think, a little bit of luck. Electoral outcomes, the fact was that when you had an electoral outcome in Egypt that they gave Islamists an overwhelming majority in parliament, things began to go wrong. Whereas in Tunisia, the fact was that the Islamist movement had to, if it wanted to get things done, learn to work with other movements, and other movements had perhaps a little bit less daunting Islamist movement to face. You had the military as a veto a very powerful veto power player in Egypt, so that all political actors knew that if things did not go that way, they could appeal to the army, and that's what they did from day one in the process. Whereas in Tunisia, again, once more, they had to deal with each other, or they were thrown into dealing with each other to a much stronger extent. My sense also is that the role of the Salafis was a critical and probably overlooked factor in Egypt when they entered the political process, and did very well in electoral terms. If you talk to people in the Brotherhood in the period in which the parliament was meeting, and even after the parliament was dissolved, one of their biggest concerns was not the non-Islamists, but it was these Salafis. And during Mohamed Morsi's presidency, he made policy just as much with regard to how it was going to play with the rivalry with the Salafis, pulling him farther you could say, to the Islamist right. In Tunisia, the Salafis sat outside the process and played much more of a spoiler role. And again, my impression from afar is that Nahda did try to sort of play a little bit of a role of kind of reaching out, perhaps bringing the Salafis along, but ultimately, especially with the rise of political violence, were called upon to repudiate the Salafis in a way that the Brotherhood in Egypt never felt it could do, right up until Morsi's final weeks in office. So that there were these I'd say sort of structural differences between the two, or these structural differences and the procedural differences that made the Tunisian experience, I think, an awful lot more favorable. In 2 visits into Tunisia, and this is a country that I know only very superficially, however, I discovered something very, very interesting. And that was whenever I was asked by Tunisians about comparing the two processes, and I would go into this, why can't Egypt be more like Tunisia, kind of grade school teacher trope, most of the Tunisians I would speak to would get upset. They'd say, wait a second, we're just as screwed up as everybody else. and this puzzled me, okay, because I wasn't quite used to that as an attitude. But I'm beginning now, I think, to understand exactly what it is. Yes, we're entering, we just went through a very, very hopeful period in Tunisia. And a period in which the Tunisians demonstrated that they could do what the Egyptians couldn't do. So yes, there is reasons to be helpful. But I think what Tunisians have discovered over this time is what anybody who's ever lived in any actual existing democracy has always known, and that is that while democracy is beautiful, democratic politics is ugly. And Tunisians are getting ready for regular democratic politics, or they've been playing regular democratic politics in some of its ugliest manifestations. If there is one thing, I often said that the Arab uprisings of 2011 were about, it was about a great faith in politics. An assumption that if these various societies could only get their political systems down right in a way in which those people who held authority in all realms, political, economic, social, and so on, could be held accountable to the interests of the society as a whole, that these societies would be able to realize great progress. What these societies have come to realize, and has been very, very difficult, is there is no such thing as society as a whole. That these societies are in fact very, very badly divided. They have different values. They have their class divisions, their regional divisions throughout them. And a lot of what normal democratic politics is about taking various elements within the society and basically forcing them to live together in ways that is not always easy. And that's in essence what I think that the Egyptians have not been able to do. When politics, not in this elevated sense from Aristotle and Hannah Arendt and so on, of commonly deliberating about public affairs, but when politics in the dirty sense of cutting deals and making compromises with people you don't like, when politics in the dirty sense takes over, the Egyptian process basically began to go very badly awry. The Tunisian process threatened to go awry at every single turn, but ultimately pulled back. And it's very interesting in this regard. And I think Duncan was right to highlight this, the way the Tunisian constitution was adopted, right? Egyptians have been called to the poll 3 times to approve a constitution. And they did it each time. March 2011 to approve some constitutional amendments. In December 2012 to approve a constitution. In January 2014 to approve another constitution. And each time they approved it. The number of Egyptians who voted for these constitutions is in the tens of millions. The number of Tunisians who voted for the 2014 constitution in Tunisia numbers barely in the hundreds. Why? It's because it was passed by an assembly and it was not, as Duncan said, referred to the Tunisian voters. So you have, in a sense, a constitution that was cut by not necessarily a backroom deal, maybe a front room deal, because everybody could see the bargaining that was going on, but was still a product not of 50% plus one politics, but it was instead all the political leadership in the country getting together. I am assuming that had this constitution actually been presented for a popular referendum, it would have passed overwhelmingly, but what the Tunisian process was designed, whether by luck or by a wisdom, I don't know. I suspect the first. They had a mechanism which gave a very, very strong encouragement to exactly that kind of consensus process. So that's all good, and that's why Tunisia gets to kind of go to the head of the class and be a model for other Arab states that want to go through this process. But I want to suggest something else as well, and that is that Tunisians are getting ready for politics in this dirty sense, or been playing politics in this dirty sense for some time, and we're about to see what normal politics looks like. And let me illustrate this particularly with reference to what Duncan mentioned. This is the Islamic provisions of this constitution. If you were to take all Arab constitutions together and collate them together in a book and read them from beginning to the Tunisian, which is perhaps the final and the ultimate and the happy ending, I guess, you'd see something very, very interesting. Well, first, you'd probably have few people who would read the book. But I actually have read the various constitutions, and the plot line that you get is what I've called Islamic inflation, right? The earliest Arab constitutional documents don't say anything about Islam. Then one country mentions it. The first country to have a Sharia-based provision was Syria in 1950, and actually a fairly secular political system. Kuwait writes around in the 1960s, well, the Syrians think they're Muslims. We can have something stronger than this, and you have some can you top this politics going on. And the reason you have that is because everybody wants to prove their Islamic credentials, and nobody really takes these words very seriously as ones that will have operative legal meaning. What happens after 2011, and to some extent a little bit before because of I think the fact that the Egyptian constitutional tradition, for all its authoritarian nature, actually takes on some real meaning and some teeth. So you have it in Egypt beginning in about the 1980s or so, but after 2011 you have this sense in which when constitutions are really written by kind of these social processes rather than rulers kind of codifying their desires, what you have instead is a process by which societies are sitting down and trying to write constitutions. All of a sudden people are beginning to take the words a little bit more seriously and thinking very, very carefully, if we use this word and not that word, what are the legal implications? And with the Tunisian solution is basically to say, okay, we're not going to say that much. Problem solved? No. What that means is that these basic debates about identity, about Islam, about the nature of the legal system, about the relation between religion and state get deferred. They're no longer codified in constitutional terms, but they get deferred to the normal political process. And those people in this room, and I would guess there are many of them who live in the United States of America, know what happens then. Is you get basically a politics that can be nasty, that can be dirty, that can use religion in all kinds of ways in normal election campaigns. And I suspect that what Tunisians should be getting themselves ready for is, as I say, the ugly nature of democratic politics. One that is far, far better than the ugly nature of authoritarian politics that the Egyptians are now rediscovering, but still one in which sort of a lot of the basic struggles of political life will be transferred to sort of daily back and forth bargaining, ones that, given all the alternatives, is probably the best way to handle it, but ones that, as I say, when the kind of the initial enthusiasm of passing this constitution wears off and people get ready and begin to practice normal politics, will probably turn a few stomachs in the process. Thank you.
Thank you. I can't help adding a couple comments with the permission of the chair. These events and their context remind me of a story that everybody's forgotten that was popular in Tunisia in the 60s, if you remember the 60s. It was told that a man went 20 years later into the Encyclopedia Britannica and looked up events about the Arab world and looked up Nasser. And it said, a minor Arab potentate during the reign of Bourguiba. 2 points that are funny about that. One is, of course, the ridiculousness of it, and it was a good Tunisian joke at the time. but also the pride that the Tunisians had, after all. I mean, that's a good story. And I think the events of the last 3 years are Tunisia's revenge. Tunisia began the overthrow of the government in Egypt. I think there are a couple things to bring out in addition to the very good rundown that we've had. One, it was said that Nahda won the elections, but Nahda didn't win the elections. It only got 40%, and I think this was very important in the debate that went on within Nahda as to whether it should be strong-fisted or whether it should look for compromise. But in the contradictions, as Nathan has been mentioning, contradictions of compromise politics, many people in Nahda thought they won. And so there was this idea, we didn't win and we have to compromise, but we really won. And that created an awful lot of tension then within the leading party in Tunisia. And the result, however, but the result was that in the making of the constitution, enormous concessions were made, and almost all the concessions were made by Nahda. So that we have the Constitution now that they brought themselves into living with, and they brought in to the whole Tunisian society, so that we have a constitution that is the result of normal politics. I like the phrase of concessions among the various parties. There's another thing that I think has rarely been picked up, and that is that in another dimension, the Tunisian constitution was the result of negotiation. But not negotiation so much back and forth, or not just negotiation on a horizontal level between the parties in the National Constituent Assembly, but a vertical negotiation between the government, Nahda dominated, and civil society. Nahda would come out, the government would come out with some proposition, and there would be a public outcry. And then it would pull back. And so that concession process was not just horizontal, but was vertical. And in that verticality of negotiation between government and civil society, including the UGTT, but lots of other organizations and the street, Tunisia continued, and is probably the only state that has continued, the tradition of the Intifada in 2011-2012. That is the uprising, which came from the street negotiating then with the government to get rid of Ben Ali and then to go on into the Ashur Commission and so on. A remarkable tradition to continue, and one in which the process was probably more democratic, lowercase, than one usually recognizes. It's a constitution to be proud of. It's a funny constitution. It has sleepers in it, and one of the contradictions on the other side of one of the feelings on the other side, the Nida Tunis side and the liberal side, is that there would be things in the constitution that the Islamists would take advantage of if they ever got into power. And the Islamists, on the other hand, feared, and there's a deep fear that the liberals were out to get them out of power forever. And now they were in, they had their chance, and now they're out. And the possibility, the likelihood is that we'll have a meeting here after the elections, but the likelihood is that Nahda will drop a good deal in its electoral representation when the parliamentary elections are held. So these underlying feelings are part of that process as well in this complex constitution-making business. The other thing, finally, and Duncan has mentioned, is the Constitution contains a major contradiction. It's a bicephalic government in which there's a problem, power both with the president and with the assembly elected prime minister. And if they are from different parties, and France and other countries tell us about this problem from time to time, there can be a government stalemate rather than progress. And yet, I think we are here celebrating a very important event, and one that really continues to be a hallmark of progress within the context of the Arab Spring. We have a special guest here to help us celebrate that, and I would ask the ambassador to come and say a word. Ambassador Shalefa has been Shalefa, that's right, has risen the ambassadorial ladder from being ambassador to South Africa, along with Mozambique and Namibia and Angola, to ambassador to Australia, and then ambassador to Spain, and now he's arrived in the United States. Welcome here. And he's an agile ambassador, too.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really pleased today to join this vibrant forum, and I would like to express my appreciation for the efforts made by the organizers, for the quality of the analysis made by eminent experts, and for the interest of the audience. Today I'm a very happy ambassador, seeing my country under the spotlights and enjoying an international recognition. I think Tunisia is achieving a historic breakthrough with this constitution. But I think that this success remains unfinished and fragile. I'm not going to dare discuss or challenge the views expressed by eminent speakers. I just want to make two very brief comments on that. The first comment: despite the democratic and secular standards it enshrines, this new constitution is not of a great value if it's not supported by a civic culture and a democratic environment. I think that the learning process will take some time to reach a full maturity. The second comment: this emerging democracy in Tunisia needs to be consolidated and protected. In this regard, Tunisian people is counting on themselves and counts also on the assistance and support of France, of allies, and among them, of course, United States. We have the ambition to build a new strategic agenda with the United States. New strategic agenda based on common strategic interests and in common democratic values. This new agenda should consist on security, economic development, and investment and trade. A free trade agreement would be instrumental in generating economic growth and consolidating Tunisia's new path toward political and democratic liberalism. Thank you very much.
I'll take questions. Thank you very much. We're open for questions now, and we have a lot of people and not as much time as we'd like, but I'd like to take a couple questions at a time. Yes. There's a microphone somewhere around here. Microphones and PowerPoint are things we spend a lot of time playing with.
Now works. Thank you, Professor. My question is, do you believe that women had a great part in shaping the new constitution? Because I was in Tunis a few days before the new constitution. I had the impression that was the society to say no to the attempt to go back with the parity between men and women. And the second point is, do we realize that at this point is the international community which has the onus to help Tunisia, as you did after the Second World War with Europe, Italy, France and Germany, and now we have the same problem that is going on since 3 years. Investment, money.
Thank you. And we had a question over there.
Thanks. I was wondering if we could return to the role of the labor unions, particularly the UGTT, as Duncan, as you had mentioned, as like a veto power, but also as a power broker in some of these more dirty or ugly democratic politics. And maybe, Professor Brown, if you wanted to make a note about the absence of such a democratic veto power in Egypt.
Okay. And behind you, over there's the same. Well, I'm looking over there. We'll come back. Okay. Tom Friedman, welcome here.
Couple of related questions. Nathan, you could take it, or Duncan, I think. One is it just a coincidence that the Arab Spring country that the United States had the least to do with and involvement has been the most successful? I wondered if you could go back to this elusive issue of civil society. Where did Tunisia get it, and in what ways did it have an advantage over Egypt? In what ways did it have more depth, breadth, and coherence?
Good. Duncan, you want to begin, and we'll go down the row?
Sure. Okay, I'll say a few about all of them. First, about the role of women. So there was a women's quota in the elections for the Constituent Assembly. It was what's called a horizontal or a vertical zipper, which means that each of the lists from the parties had to alternate between men and women. But there was not what's then called a horizontal zipper, which means that parties have to alternate the heads of the lists across each of the districts. So it turns out that I think there were 27 women elected. Wait, is that right? 39? Women, yeah. About 40, 39, 40 women in the assembly, but I think then 33 of them came from Ennahda. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. And that is because Ennahda was the only party that consistently won more than one seat, which meant that they got the second seat from their list. So that meant that there were only 7 women representing secular parties out of 217 members of the Constituent Assembly. I think that I hope that this is a problem that they will address in creating gender parity in accordance with Article 45. But that said, there were women that were engaged in each of the constitutional committees. They were engaged in the leadership of the assembly and not so much in the leadership of the parties. But there's certainly a lot of room to improve. But there are more stories about that. But about the involvement of about civil society in general. I think that Professor Zartman's point was definitely astute about the way that certain issues related to the constitution-making process got bounced back to civil society and then blown up in civil society and then curtailed. The most important example, I would say, is about this draft language that came out about the role of women being. The formulation was that women were equal because they were man's complement in society. I think that the Arabic got a little bit messed up in the translation to French, and that it wasn't actually as inflammatory necessarily as it was not the right formulation at all. But anyway, that blew up to a national scale, and the committee that was working on that, which actually hadn't at that point been under very much public scrutiny for the work that it had been doing, quickly amended the language to make it just an absolute equality provision. The civil society was also very engaged in the process. The constitutional committees themselves had hearings with members of civil society. There's a very important organization called Al Bawsala, which is a transparency organization, and they were. They have this amazing team of Tunisians that are in the assembly keeping track. So there's actually not a public. The assembly itself doesn't publish the results of votes in the assembly. The votes flash up on a screen. It's all electronic voting. The votes flash up on a screen very briefly, but then they're not published. So all of these Bawsala volunteers would go to the assembly and take screenshots of their phone of this screen, and then they'd send it to their back room, and then they would actually account for which members of the assembly corresponded to these little green dots on the screen, and then they publish and it's all online. And then when you're in the assembly, you're up above, and you can see the desks of the assembly members down below. And a bunch of them had their computer screens open to the Bawsala website to see who was actually voting. And then and a lot of the Bawsala members were engaged in advocacy for particular articles from time to time. And Amira Yahyaoui, who's the president of Bawsala, she was congratulated just as equally as members of the assembly after this Article 45 provision was passed. So there are a number of examples like this. I think that civil society organizations, I wouldn't say were sitting down. They weren't seen as equal members of the assembly. They weren't sitting down with assembly members working on texts in all cases. But when certain issues got to a certain level, and certainly when the debates were more public, the civil society was involved. And just very quickly about this, Tunisia most successful, at least, engagement from the U.S. I think that there could be an issue of correlation doesn't equal causation in all of this. I think that Tunisia is out of the spotlight for a lot of reasons, and that definitely gave them the space to make up their own decisions about certain things. But yeah. I do think that that the ambassador is right in calling for a role for the United States in promoting and in continuing to support Tunisia in its democratic transition, probably more in the areas of investment and trade, as the ambassador mentioned. But I think that there are some political institutions that the U.S. government should be engaged in supporting, particularly the Constitutional Court, as I mentioned, leveraging examples of other courts, helping them design courts, supporting the administration of courts and these kinds of things. So.
I'll try to handle these questions very quickly, partly because Duncan has already ably answered them, and also because I actually have to rush out at the end of this round of questions because I have duties back at my university. So let me first, the question about women, in terms of women's roles, that I can't add to anything that Duncan said. I don't know, but I will point to one thing that's very interesting. There was all this attention, as he said, on the women's representation clause. If you look at Islamist movements comparatively, those which are not Salafi don't really have a big issue with women's representation. They're not in favor of it necessarily, but they don't have any problem with it for the most part. Salafi movements vary. The real concession for Ennahda was on personal status law. In comparative terms, and in a sense, I think this is the issue that really, really matters for every member of the society. It determines your rights and duties and obligations from the minute you're born till the minute you die. So it matters to everybody. And the fact is that Islamic personal status law, which is the basis for personal status law in all countries in the Arab world, is highly gendered. It certainly gives women's rights, but it's generally not equal rights. The Tunisian personal status code basically pushes that Islamic legal heritage as far as it can in an egalitarian direction. And for Ennahda to essentially accept that was probably the most significant ideological concession, the most practical one. Most of the others are symbolic in nature. The constitutional language on Sharia, women's representation in parliament, this is really, really really practical, and so it's really, really big. So to me, it's probably those people who hold up El Nahda as a movement that is ideologically kind of more towards the center. This is, to me, the thing that really calls out for attention. In terms of the question about civil society and then the labor movement, to me, these are sort of related. There is a vitality to Egyptian public life that predates 2011 that is very, very impressive. But it's also a little bit inchoate, right? Who were the big movements in 2011? They were these sort of vaguely formed sort of youth movements. Labor actually played a role and continues to play a role, but it's very, very badly divided. You have an officially sponsored trade union, you have independent trade unions, they're in a state of civil war against each other. Labor is not a cohesive and coherent political actor in Egypt. It's divided among itself. It is not really able to play any role. The top leadership of the labor movement in Egypt was interested but in basically enshrining in the Egyptian constitution a monopoly of representation for themselves over labor. And they got that in the constitution. So essentially they got a corporatist arrangement in which the current Egyptian trade union leadership, which is in a sense part of the state apparatus, gets to speak for labor. In Tunisia, you have them as an independent actor. So again, my impression is that if you talk about civil society in the broad sense, in Egypt in 2011 is off to a better start, but it's also off to a much less coherent start. And again, the presence of a very strong, independent, and fairly coherent and to some extent politically sophisticated labor leadership in Tunisia is something that was lacking in Egypt, and I think Egyptians are paying the price for that. Finally, about U.S. involvement, and my comment here, yes, I would echo what Duncan said. The fact is, this is an inward-looking moment for all of these societies, and yes, the United States has sort of said certain things and not said certain things. But I'm not sure that has tremendous effect. The one thing that the United States, I think, could have done to really affect transitions, which would have been to essentially try to assist in a very major way the new post-2011 governments to be associated with policy success, with a tremendous aid program, was one that was politically and fiscally impossible in the United States in 2011. It probably would have made a difference. It was, as I say, politically and fiscally impossible. I take perhaps the ambassador's comments to be a diplomatic, and he is a diplomat, way of saying it's not too late, you can still help. And my guess is that is still a fairly healthy message. The idea that what happens in Tunisia now will spread automatically to other Arab countries, I think, is not realistic. But the idea that you could have one Arab country that holds out itself as a kind of distant model that is still relevant, that kind of enters the kind of lexicon of Arab political argumentation, is one that would be a healthy development and probably needs. And I answer this not simply as an academic, but as a U.S. taxpayer. It's probably one that does need some international support.
You're not the typical U.S. taxpayer.
Do you want to, Mr. Ambassador, you want to say something? Okay. I would just come down very heavily on this business of U.S. support. The United States was supportive of Tunisia under Secretary Clinton, and then the awful event of the embassy took place, the attack, and the U.S. government felt that there was not enough of an apology, and that certainly there was not enough of alacrity, which was characteristic of the Nahda-led government, in finding the people who carried it out, and the freeze turned on. It's time we get over it. That was an awful thing, but it's time we get over it. And Tunisia now, having done its political thing, needs a real push of economic support, both in trade and in aid, not just in aid, but in trade as well. Tunisia is a land of businessmen, Carthage and all that. It's in the middle of the Mediterranean, and these people are very good private enterprise people, but they need investment, they need assistance in the economy now and fast. Another round of questions? Yeah. Oh, okay.
Hi, just one quick question for Duncan. How do the parties that were part of the coalition with Nahda, Marzouki and Takatu, how do they see any potential future cooperation with Nahda given the contradictions between Prime Minister and Presidency?
Okay. Over here? Yeah.
One of the divisions in Tunisia is between the coastal area and the interior. And I think it's worth noting that the Arab Spring began in central Tunisia. And if you go back a little, I don't remember the 60s, Bill, but I can go back to the 80s. The early 80s, there were bread riots when President Bourguiba removed the subsidies or lowered them on bread. And they started in central Tunisia. So my question is, are the interests and concerns of the much poorer, particularly agriculturally related areas taken into consideration in the Constitution, both in the Constitution itself and in the process that led to the Constitution?
Thanks, Jim. The ATA's former president. And then one over here in the... You had a question? No, you didn't have a question. Okay. I've never... What an extraordinary panel they did. Did we just close the questions out of people? Okay, we'll take it, and then we'll even end on time.
Good. Well, it gives me a chance to talk about labor unions, which I forgot to do as well. So, just first about the Troika. Well, CPR and Takatul have really fallen off in terms of popularity, and I don't think very many people really expect them to do very well in the next elections. Marzouki is thinking about running. He might have decided already. I'm not sure, but he's probably the only one. And Ben Jaffer and Takatul, they really alienated their base by entering the coalition with Ennahda in the first place. So I think, I think really the question is, what kind of arrangements could we imagine with this president and prime minister? And it's actually somewhat related to your question, sir, as well. It's about the electoral law. The Constitution sets up a divided government, and the electoral law, if it continues if it mirrors the law that was used in 2011, makes it very difficult for large parties to amass large numbers of seats. Mainly because well, for several reasons. One is that the districts themselves are quite large, and mainly to increase interior representation. And also the formula that's used to assign votes to seats makes it very expensive vote-wise for larger parties for parties that already have seats to acquire additional seats. So according to other electoral formulas that are used in other countries in the world, Ennahda would have won 60 to 70 to 80% of the seats in the assembly based on the 2011 election results. This may or may not have to do with the fact that the law was written by the Benishore Commission. So then the question is, if they use the same formula, which they probably will, then it will be difficult for any party to pick up a plurality in the assembly, which means that the prime minister will have to be the result of some kind of negotiation between political parties. How that plays out is an open question. Nida Tunis is doing very well in polls, so is Ennahda. Head-to-head, they're about even, but there are a lot of undecided voters, and it's very unclear how this election is going to play out. So that's sort of answer. It's not an answer, but that raises questions about who's going to be prime minister, and then president is a head-to-head election between. Who knows? Who knows who Ennahda is going to put forward? Jabali, Jabali is sort of more popular because he stepped down voluntarily, but no one in Ennahda likes him. Larayed probably is unrunnable. It's really an open question who they're going to run, and then who does Nida Tunis run? Are they going to do a Sebsi? He's 88, going to be 88. Who else? Who else is going to be there? So it's really an open field. Again, about representation from the interior, this is the key question facing Tunisia's economic development, which relates to the political representation questions, and I think has to be the cornerstone of any kind of economic policy, and hopefully any investment policy coming from, especially foreign investment. in terms of political representation, I think that they did structure the electoral system to disproportionately represent populations from the interior and the south, but it's just a fact of Tunisian demographics that 20% of the population is in Tunis and over 50% is on the coast. So it's always going to take sort of progressive thinking, linking the two halves of the economy to move it forward. I wouldn't say that, other than disproportionately over-representing these southern and interior districts, there's nothing particularly representative in the Constitution about the interior or the South. But this isn't a surprise to policymakers. It's an enormous challenge, but I think everyone's sort of aware of it. And just quickly on the UGTT and the labor unions, it was interesting. They sort of fluctuated in and out of the public debate, the UGTT, about when they were important, when they weren't. They decided early on that they weren't going to run in 2011, they decided they weren't going to organize a list, which some people thought they were going to do. So I think that they were happy sort of being in the background. And when I said veto power, I meant that many of the uprisings in Tunisia have started from general strikes that were called by the UGTT, and that was in the background of everyone's mind. But I think that ultimately, when they were playing this role of mediator between the parties, they really had their own interests at heart, and weren't really genuine mediators. And I think that's a big reason why the national dialogue sputtered.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I think we've had a very a good tour of the horizon of the Constitution, and now we have the politics to look for. But before that, we offer you, this being a Tunisian event, we offer you something to eat in the room next door. Thank you.